Hello, my name is Vivian, and I'm 91 years old. At my age, people assume you spend all day knitting or that your mind starts making things up. So, for almost 40 years, my own family thought I was crazy. I'd tell them, kids, at my wedding, Laura Branigan herself came on stage and sang Gloria just for me. My children would roll their eyes. My friends would say it was a cover band. But today, I found the shoebox that proves everything. Stick around because I'm going to tell you how a 47-year-old woman in 1982 had the most extravagant wedding in all of New York. To really understand the absolute madness of what happened at my wedding, you first have to travel back in time with me. You have to understand who I was and what the world looked like in 1982. Think about the United States back then. It was a country changing at breakneck speed. Ronald Reagan was in the White House, the economy was a constant whirlwind, and the streets of New York were pure, unadulterated chaos. Neon lights everywhere, yellow cabs honking at all hours, and young Wall Street hotshots running around with those boxy briefcases. Everything in the air seemed to scream modernity, success, and the future. But, funny enough, if you were a woman and you were 47 years old, society suddenly operated by the rules of a bygone century. I was 47 in 1982, and to make matters worse, according to the rigid standards of the time, I was a divorced woman. Today, women in their 40s and 50s are conquering the world, completely rebooting their lives, founding incredible companies, or traveling solo to exotic places. They are celebrated. But in the early 80s, in your typical quiet American suburbs, being my age and being separated was like wearing a heavy, invisible sign on your forehead that read, "Past expiration date." You became invisible. Literally, people stopped noticing you at parties, at dinners, in the grocery store aisle. The social expectations were brutal and, above all, silent. It was just assumed that your era of romance, passion, and doing beautifully crazy things was permanently over. What the world expected of you was to chop your hair into a sensible, practical bob, start wearing boring pastel twin sets, stay home waiting for grandchildren to babysit, or spend your afternoons playing cards with other women in your exact same boat. You were expected to bow out of an active social life gracefully, without making a fuss, accepting that your time in the sun had passed. But my name, Vivian, means full of life. And I promise you, from the very bottom of my heart, I absolutely refuse to fade into the gray shadows of suburban complacency. I felt like my life wasn't ending. It was just entering its most interesting and liberated chapter. While other women my age were resigning themselves to invisibility and silence, I was taking the train every single morning right into the hustle and bustle of Manhattan. I worked at a public relations agency right in the beating heart of the city. It was a heavily male-dominated corporate environment, ruthless, fast-paced, and sometimes cruel. But I loved it. I wore tailored power suits with massive shoulder pads, the kind that made you feel like you could kick down the door of any boardroom just by walking toward it. I painted my lips a fierce, unapologetic red every single day, used enough hairspray to make my hair completely defy the laws of gravity, and I walked down Fifth Avenue with my head held high, letting the sharp click-clack of my heels set the rhythm of my own personal rebellion. All those clothes, all that defiant attitude, that was my daily armor. It was my constant way of screaming at the world without using a single word. I am still here. I am still relevant. I am still attractive, and I still have a whole lot of noise left to make. Under no circumstances was I going to let anyone tell me that my time to love madly, to dance until dawn, or to be the center of attention had expired. I deeply despised that cultural notion that only blind youth deserved to be celebrated and lived to the fullest. I had been through a painful, failed marriage that had left me with a few deep scars, that's true. But that failure hadn't stripped away a single drop of my hope. On the contrary, it had given me an absolute razor-sharp clarity about what I was no longer willing to tolerate, and an insatiable thirst for what I knew I actually deserved to have. I still believed, with every fiber of my being, in the magic of second chances. I believed blindly in romantic love, in instant sparks, in that electric feeling in your stomach that something wonderful is just about to happen right around the corner. Even if that corner was in the middle of the deafening chaos of New York City, I was ready to devour life, not retire from it. And it was exactly with that unbreakable attitude, with that defiant energy vibrating in every step I took through the city, that the universe decided to test me and cross my path with a man who would change my entire story forever, right at the exact moment society was demanding I bring down the curtain. It was a Tuesday evening in late November of 1981, and Manhattan was experiencing one of those torrential, merciless downpours that instantly turned the city into an absolute nightmare. You know the exact kind of rain I'm talking about, the kind that makes the streets slick with oil, swallows up the neon lights in a depressing gray blur, and makes finding an available yellow cab an extreme Olympic sport. I had just walked out of a dreadful, exhausting client meeting. I was standing on the corner of 57th and Broadway, completely soaked to the bone. My carefully sculpted hair had completely surrendered to the humidity, and those fierce shoulder pads I wore like daily armor were now acting like heavy, depressing sponges. I was freezing, frustrated, and ready to scream at the sky. Finally, through the thick curtain of rain, I spotted an empty cab pulling over to the curb. I sprinted toward it on my heels, reached out and grabbed the slick metal of the door handle. But at that exact same millisecond, another hand grabbed it too. I whipped my head around, fully prepared to unleash the kind of fiery, unapologetic New York rage that only a tired public relations executive can muster. I was ready to fight for that cab. But when I looked up, all my anger just evaporated into the cold air. There he was, Arthur. He didn't look like the slick, aggressive Wall Street guys I was used to dealing with. He was wearing an oversized, slightly rumpled trench coat, his glasses were fogged up from the rain, and he had the kindest, most exhausted, yet deeply amused eyes I had ever seen. He didn't yell, he didn't try to push past me, he just let out a warm, rumbling laugh, graciously opened the door for me, and said, "I'll let you take it, but only if you promise to drop me off on your way, and only if you tell me why a woman with such a fabulous outfit is standing out here trying to catch pneumonia." That shared cab ride was supposed to last 15 minutes. Instead, we ended up sitting in a cramped, brightly lit diner until 2 in the morning, drinking terrible coffee and talking as if we had known each other for decades. Arthur wasn't in the corporate world at all. He was a sound engineer. He spent his days and nights buried in dimly lit recording studios, surrounded by massive mixing boards, endless tangles of cables, and the heavy scent of stale cigarette smoke and vinyl records. He possessed this incredibly grounding, steady, patient energy that perfectly balanced the loud, frantic, hurricane-like pace of my own life. The romance that followed wasn't the slow, cautious, overly sensible courtship that society expects from two people approaching 50. It was an absolute whirlwind. It was electric. We were two people who had lived enough life to know exactly what we were looking at. When you fall in love at 47, you don't have the luxury or the patience to play silly games. You don't hide your flaws or pretend to be someone else. We laid all our cards on the table, our past heartbreaks, our failures, our deepest hopes. We were falling madly in love, and it felt like waking up from a long, dreamless sleep. 6 months later, there was no grand cinematic proposal. We were just sitting on the floor of his cramped, messy apartment, eating cheap Chinese takeout right out of the little white boxes, listening to an old jazz record. Arthur looked at me, set his chopsticks down, took my hand, and simply said, "Vivian, let's stop wasting time. Let's get married." And I said yes with a heart so full it felt like it might burst. But the moment we announced our engagement, the well-meaning whispers started. My friends and colleagues immediately began suggesting age-appropriate weddings. "Oh, Vivian," they would say with that condescendingly sweet tone, "you should do a nice, quiet afternoon tea. Maybe a lovely little garden ceremony with just a few people. You could wear a tasteful, simple beige suit." Beige! I almost gagged at the word. I had spent my entire adult life fighting tooth and nail against the beigeification of my existence. I looked at Arthur that night and told him exactly what was in my soul. I said, "I don't want quiet. I don't want tasteful or subdued. I want a celebration that screams from the rooftops. I want a party that tells the whole world we are alive. We found each other against all odds. And we are wildly, passionately in love." Arthur just smiled that steady smile of his. We didn't have a massive budget. We were just two working-class people trying to survive in an expensive city, so we couldn't afford the Plaza Hotel or mountains of caviar. But Arthur had something far more valuable in 1980s New York than a fat bank account. He had a golden Rolodex. He had spent years in the trenches of the music industry, doing favors for producers, session musicians, and managers. He knew the people who pulled the strings behind the curtain, and because he loved me enough to want to give me the loud, vibrant, unforgettable night I was desperately craving, he decided right then and there that it was time to cash in every single favor he had ever earned. By the time the sweltering summer of 1982 rolled around, the entire city of New York was practically vibrating with a brand new frequency. If you were alive and breathing that year, you know exactly what I am talking about. Sometime around June, a song hit the airwaves that didn't just climb the charts. It absolutely exploded into the cultural stratosphere. It was Gloria by Laura Branigan. You literally could not escape it, no matter where you went. It was blasting out of the rolled-down windows of yellow cabs stuck in heavy midtown traffic. It was echoing through the fluorescent-lit aisles of every grocery store. It was the pulsing heartbeat of every single nightclub from Manhattan all the way down to Brooklyn. The second those iconic driving synthesizers kicked in, the energy in any room completely shifted. It was electric. But for me, Gloria wasn't just a catchy pop song playing in the background of my life. It became my absolute, undeniable personal anthem. The lyrics told the story of a woman who was constantly on the run, a woman who had voices in her head telling her how to live, what to do, and who she was supposed to be. It was about breaking free from those suffocating expectations. Every single time I heard Laura's powerful, raspy, unapologetic voice belting out those words, I felt like she was singing directly to my soul. I would stand in the middle of my tiny apartment, holding a hairbrush like a microphone, and sing it at the absolute top of my lungs. I sang it while I was getting dressed in my sharp power suits. I sang it while burning our dinners. I sang it because, for the first time in my 47 years, I finally felt like I was the one dictating the pace of my own life. I wasn't running anymore. I had finally arrived. Arthur, being the incredibly observant and deeply loving man that he was, noticed this. He saw the way my eyes completely lit up and how my posture changed the second those opening chords played on the radio. He saw how that song made me feel invincible, defiant, and completely alive. And because Arthur was a man who spoke the language of music much better than he spoke anything else, he secretly decided that he was going to give me a wedding gift that no one else in the world could ever replicate. Now, remember what I told you about Arthur's golden Rolodex? Well, one of his oldest and dearest friends in the recording industry happened to work as an executive over at Atlantic Records, and Atlantic Records just so happened to be the exact label that had signed Laura Branigan. Through the underground grapevine of late-night studio sessions, endless coffees, and industry gossip, Arthur found out a piece of information that felt like a pure cosmic alignment. Laura was going to be in New York City doing a massive promotional press tour during the exact same weekend we had booked our wedding reception. For a normal person, this would just be a fun coincidence to mention at dinner, but for Arthur, it was an opportunity he simply could not let pass. He picked up the rotary phone in our kitchen. He called in every single favor he had ever banked over 20 years of working in the trenches of the New York music scene. He negotiated, he pleaded, and he utilized every ounce of quiet charm he possessed. He bypassed the aggressive booking agents and went straight to the people whose careers he had helped build when they were just starting out. And then he did something incredibly reckless and fiercely romantic. We had a small savings account at the local bank, a modest little fund that we had been slowly scraping together to pay for a very simple, quiet honeymoon down in Florida. Without breathing a single word of it to me, Arthur went to the bank and took every last dime out of that honeymoon fund. He bet our entire future vacation on one wild, seemingly impossible idea just to give me the ultimate moment of glory. It finally arrived, August 14th, 1982. I remember the morning air was thick with that classic unforgiving New York City summer humidity, but I honestly couldn't have cared less. I was too busy staring at my reflection in the mirror, feeling like a completely brand new woman. My friends had practically begged me to wear something sensible, maybe a muted ivory suit or a modest tea-length dress with a high collar. Absolutely not. I walked down the aisle in a brilliant, shimmering white silk gown that clung to my curves and caught the light with every single step I took. It had dramatic, sweeping sleeves and a neckline that definitely made a few of my older, more conservative relatives gasp out loud. And my hair? Oh, my hair was a glorious, towering masterpiece of hairspray. It was so big and rigid it was probably a legitimate fire hazard, but it was the 80s, and bigger was always better. I looked in the mirror, and I didn't see a middle-aged divorcee settling for a quiet second act. I saw a queen stepping into her absolute prime, ready to claim every single ounce of happiness she was owed. We didn't get married in a stuffy country club or a sterile hotel ballroom. We rented out this incredibly charming, slightly rough around the edges banquet hall deep in the heart of Brooklyn. It had these glorious crystal chandeliers, a massive wooden dance floor that had seen decades of celebrations, and a bar that never seemed to run dry. The room was absolutely packed to the brim with the most wonderful, chaotic mix of human beings you could ever imagine. On one side of the room, you had my glamorous, fast-talking public relations colleagues from Manhattan, dripping in chunky gold jewelry and smelling like expensive French perfume. On the other side, you had Arthur's crew, the session musicians, the sound engineers, the eccentric producers with their wild hair and leather jackets. It was a beautiful, loud collision of our two worlds. We were eating rich, buttery cake, clinking our champagne glasses so hard they nearly shattered, and dancing until our feet ached. The air was thick with laughter, the smell of roasted meats, and, because it was 1982, a very healthy cloud of cigarette smoke hovering near the ceiling. It was, by all accounts, the most perfect, joy-filled night of my entire life. I remember leaning my head against Arthur's shoulder near the edge of the dance floor, watching our friends spin around to the sounds of a fantastic local band he had hired. I felt this overwhelming sense of peace wash over me. I looked up at him, my husband, and I thought to myself that life simply could not possibly get any better than this exact moment. I was completely satisfied. I had no idea that the real magic hadn't even started yet. The hours slipped by in a joyful blur. 10 o'clock came and went. Some of the older guests started to say their goodbyes, kissing my cheek and slipping out into the warm Brooklyn night. The photographer we had hired packed up his heavy camera gear and headed home. It was just the core group left, the people who really knew how to celebrate. And then It happened. The clock on the far wall struck 11. Right in the middle of a song, the live band abruptly stopped playing. The musicians literally put their instruments down on the stage. I frowned, suddenly confused, turning to look at Arthur to see if there was some sort of electrical problem. But Arthur wasn't looking at the band. He was looking at me, and he had this massive, impossibly mischievous grin spreading across his face. Before I could even ask him what was going on, the main overhead lights in the banquet hall completely blacked out. The entire room was plunged into sudden, pitch-black darkness. A collective gasp echoed from the crowd of guests. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, there was absolute, pin-drop silence. I stood there in the dark, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs, gripping Arthur's hand as tightly as I could. I had absolutely no idea that my life was about to become a permanent piece of musical history. The darkness in that Brooklyn banquet hall felt heavy, almost electric. I could hear the faint rustling of my silk dress as I shifted my weight, my grip on Arthur's hand tightening to the point where I was probably cutting off his circulation. I heard a low murmur ripple through the crowd of our remaining guests, the clinking of half-empty champagne glasses coming to a sudden halt, chairs scraping against the wooden floor as people tried to figure out what was happening. And then, a single, sharp spotlight cut through the pitch-black room. It didn't point at the stage. It pointed directly at Arthur and me, standing right there in the dead center of the dance floor. Arthur slowly reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a microphone. The feedback gave a tiny, sharp whine before he brought it to his lips. He looked at me, his eyes shining in that harsh white light, and he said in a voice that trembled just a fraction, "Vivian, my beautiful wife, from the moment I met you in the pouring rain, I've always told you that you are the brightest star in my universe. But tonight, to celebrate the fact that you finally chose me, I decided to bring a real star to sing for you." Before I could even process the words coming out of his mouth, a sound shattered the quiet room. It wasn't a live band tuning up. It was a massive, booming, pre-recorded track playing through the towering speakers Arthur had personally rigged for the reception. Turu-ru-ru-ru. It was those driving, unmistakable, pulsating synthesizer chords. The opening notes of Gloria, my jaw practically unhinged. I literally stopped breathing. The crowd erupted into a confused, wild cheer, thinking Arthur had just bribed the DJ to blast my favorite song for a special dance. But then a second spotlight slammed down onto the far end of the stage. The heavy velvet curtain slowly pulled back, and a figure stepped out into the light. She was wearing a stunning, shimmering outfit, her wild, glorious curls bouncing as she grabbed the microphone stand. It wasn't a tribute act, it wasn't an impersonator, it was her. It was the woman whose voice had been echoing in my tiny apartment for months. It was Laura Branigan in the flesh. She started walking directly toward me, stepping off the stage and making her way right onto the crowded dance floor, belting out those legendary first lyrics. "Gloria, you're always on the run now." Her voice was even more incredible in person. It was raw, it was raspy, it was filled with this overwhelming, undeniable power that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. The entire banquet hall lost its collective mind. People were screaming, jumping out of their seats, rushing toward the edge of the dance floor. My tough, cynical public relations friends were standing on their chairs, absolutely shrieking with joy. The veteran musicians from Arthur's World were staring in pure, unadulterated shock. And me? I just broke down. The tears completely ruined my carefully applied red lipstick and mascara, spilling down my cheeks as I brought my trembling hands to my face. I couldn't stop crying, not out of sadness, but out of a joy so profound it felt like it was going to crack my ribs wide open. Laura walked right up to me, smiling this brilliant, generous, completely genuine smile. She took my hand in hers, pulled me into the center of the spotlight, and we danced. We danced to my anthem. Arthur wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, laughing with pure triumph as the three of us swayed and spun in the middle of that chaotic, beautiful room. Laura sang the final chorus with such ferocious energy that I honestly thought the crystal chandeliers above us were going to shatter. For those 4 glorious minutes, the rest of the world completely vanished. There were no societal expectations, no hushed whispers about my age, no doubts about my future. There was just the undeniable truth that I was fiercely alive, deeply loved, and standing exactly where I was always meant to be. It was the absolute pinnacle of my existence. It was a moment of pure, uncut magic that you couldn't buy with all the money in Wall Street. But as I soon learned, when you experience a miracle that big in the days before cell phones, proving it actually happened to the rest of the world is a completely different story. If that incredible, impossible night had happened today, there would instantly be 500 different videos of it uploaded to the internet from every conceivable angle before Laura even finished singing the second chorus. It would be trending worldwide, people would be leaving millions of comments, and I would probably have my own viral hashtag. But you have to remember, my darlings, this was 1982. We lived in a completely different universe. There were no smartphones tucked into everyone's pockets. There was no social media, no instant digital proof of anything you did. If you wanted to capture a moment forever, you had to plan for it, pay for it, and pray the film didn't get ruined at the pharmacy development counter. And herein lies the absolute agonizing tragedy of my greatest memory. We had hired a fantastic professional photographer for the wedding, but because we were on a tight working class budget, Arthur had only booked him until 10 o'clock at night. The man packed up his lenses, ate a piece of cake, shook our hands, and walked out the door exactly 1 hour before the lights went out and the magic happened. But we weren't entirely without hope, or so I thought. Arthur's teenage nephew, Kevin, was an aspiring filmmaker. He had brought along one of those massive, incredibly heavy VHS camcorders, the kind you had to balance on your shoulder like a bazooka while dragging around a separate battery pack the size of a suitcase. Kevin had been filming everything. He filmed the vows, the dancing, and he was standing right at the edge of the stage, recording every single second of Laura Branigan singing to me. For 2 glorious weeks after the wedding, I knew that tape existed. We were just waiting for Kevin to bring it over so we could watch it on our television. But then, disaster struck. It was late September. The New York Yankees were playing a crucial, nail-biting game on television, and Kevin, in a moment of sheer, unthinking teenage panic because he was running out of blank tapes, grabbed the first VHS cassette he could find on his messy bedroom desk and shoved it into the VCR to record the baseball game. He didn't check the label. He recorded 3 straight hours of baseball right over my miracle. The entire performance, the dancing, the tears, completely erased, swallowed up by a Yankees victory. I honestly thought Arthur was going to disown his own nephew right then and there. At the time, we were devastated, but we thought, well, at least our friends were there. They saw it. But time is a ruthless thief. The years started slipping by faster than I could have ever imagined. The loud neon 80s faded into the 90s, and then the new millennium arrived. People moved away, people lost touch, and heartbreakingly, many of the older friends who had been in that room with us began to pass away. 10 years ago, my sweet, wonderful Arthur passed away too, taking with him the other half of my most precious memory. Suddenly, I was the only one left who actively talked about that night. And without Arthur, without our old friends around, and without any photographic evidence, my beautiful reality slowly morphed into a family myth. It became Grandma Vivian's tall tale. I would sit around the Thanksgiving table, sipping my wine, and I would try to tell the story to my teenage grandchildren. I could see them exchanging those patronizing little glances across the table. They would roll their eyes, pat my hand condescendingly, and say, "That's an amazing story, Grandma. So Laura Branigan just walked in? Sure. Did Michael Jackson jump out of the wedding cake next? They honestly thought I was losing my mind, that I was just a lonely old widow mixing up reality with an old music video I had seen on television. It was incredibly isolating. For nearly 40 years, I carried this magnificent, explosive secret inside my heart, knowing the absolute truth of it, but resigning myself to the fact that I would leave this earth with the rest of the world believing it was just the wild imagination of an old woman. For nearly 40 years, I swallowed that frustration and simply accepted my fate as the eccentric old grandmother with the wild imagination. I stopped trying to convince my family. I let them have their little condescending jokes at Thanksgiving dinners. But yesterday afternoon, the universe finally decided it was time to clear my name once and for all. I was up in the dusty, cramped attic of my house, going through a lifetime of accumulated memories. I am 91 years old now, and you start to feel this urgent, quiet need to organize what you are leaving behind. I was sitting on a creaky wooden stool surrounded by towering stacks of cardboard boxes when I stumbled upon an old, battered shoebox tucked away in the absolute darkest corner under the eaves. It was Arthur's box. He had always been a bit of a sentimental hoarder when it came to his music industry days. I blew the thick layer of dust off the lid, my hands trembling just a little bit, and I opened it up. Inside, there was a chaotic jumble of faded receipts, a few beautiful, handwritten love letters he had sent me during our whirlwind courtship, and a small stack of loose photographs that had somehow escaped the family albums. I started sifting through them, smiling at the faces of old friends who have long since passed away. And then, completely hidden near the very bottom of the box, underneath a folded-up cocktail napkin from our honeymoon, my fingers brushed against the stiff, square edge of a Polaroid picture. I pulled it out into the dim light of the attic, and my heart completely stopped beating in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there in the dust, clutching this little square of glossy paper, and I started sobbing so hard my shoulders shook. It wasn't taken by the professional photographer who had left early. It wasn't captured on that tragic, erased VHS tape. It was taken by one of Arthur's sound technician buddies who just happened to have a Polaroid camera stuffed in his leather jacket pocket that night. He had snapped exactly one photo when the lights came back on, right before Laura had to rush out the door to catch her flight. And there it was, absolute, undeniable, irrefutable proof. There is my beautiful Arthur, beaming with a smile so wide it could break your heart. There is me, 47 years old, sweating through my glamorous silk dress, my hair completely ruined by the humidity and the dancing, looking happier than any human being has a right to be, and standing squarely between us, with her arm wrapped tightly around my shoulder, laughing directly into the camera lens, is Laura Branigan. I didn't even wait to walk down the stairs. I grabbed my smartphone. Yes, I am 91, but I know how to use a family group chat. And I took a picture of that Polaroid. I sent it to every single one of my eye-rolling grandchildren with a single sentence. I told you so. The silence on their end was absolutely deafening, followed by an explosion of sheer disbelief. But I didn't make this video today just to publicly gloat, even though it feels incredibly satisfying to finally be right. I made this video for a much bigger reason. I want to look directly at whoever is watching this right now. Maybe you are 40 or 50 or even 80, and society is quietly whispering to you that your best days are in the rearview mirror. Do not listen to them. Do not let anyone, not your culture, and certainly not your own doubts, convince you to pack up your life and quietly wait for the end. Your capacity for wild, explosive joy does not come with an expiration date. Miracles do not only happen to the young. Life can still surprise you with a breathtaking soundtrack when you least expect it, as long as you have the courage to stay on the dance floor. So please, put on your best outfit, ignore the critics, and go out there and live your own Gloria.